So as some of you know, I am currently working towards getting licensure in clinical mental health counseling, and one of the things that we study is Adler, who basically came up with the theory behind what we consider birth order psychology. Adler was the one who basically came up with the framework that we commonly think of today for this idea of birth order affecting personality. And I personally find all of that really interesting because I really appreciate the social and communal aspect of identity, and because I am literally as textbook stereotypical as possible a firstborn child. I am so much a firstborn, and I've got 3 absolutely wild younger sisters, and so I was studying that, and meanwhile, I reread the Wingfeather Saga by Andrew Peterson, which is a fun Christian fantasy series following 3 siblings, each with distinct and memorable personalities. And as I was reading it, I realized that whether he planned it or not, Andrew Peterson created one of the best examples of Adlerian birth order sibling dynamics I've ever seen. Janner is the over-responsible firstborn, Kalmar/Tink is the chaotic and identity-struggling middle child, and Lily is the protected but quietly powerful youngest. Seeing the characters through this lens is actually really interesting because it sharpens and clarifies much of their personalities and character arcs. And so, because I'm a big ol' nerd, I figured I would take way too much time dissecting the psychology of Janner, Kalmar, and Lily through the lens of Adlerian birth order dynamics, and how each child develops a strategy for significance and how those strategies eventually break down and get redeemed. So each sibling begins with a survival strategy for how to matter in the family. Janner uses responsibility, Tink uses differentiation, and Lily uses relational presence. And by the end, those strategies are transformed into something deeper. FYI, there will be spoilers for the book series throughout the video. So if you haven't read it and don't want anything spoiled, then add this to your watch later and come back once you're finished. Also, I'll probably kind of switch and alternate between calling him Tink versus Kalmar versus just Cal. The books use all 3. I'm more than likely going to use all 3. So, same person. Mostly I'll probably call him Kalmar, but I'll probably use all 3. But to begin, let's start with the framework. So, Alfred Adler was one of the early psychologists, and he paid very close attention to family dynamics and birth order. And so while this idea of birth order shaping personality has kind of become a part of the pop culture, Adler's actual framework for this is much more interesting and dynamic than just saying firstborns are bossy and the youngest ones are the baby of the family. There's much more depth and psychology behind it, and it's important to note that birth order does not determine personality, but it is a factor and a social influence on personality. What Adler is really interested in is psychological positioning. And so not just like firstborn, second, third, fourth, however many. It's more about what role you occupy in the family system. How do you matter? Why do you belong? What do you have to become in order to have significance in the family? Now, there's a bunch of different aspects that play into this, and I won't get into everything, but a few that might be helpful for understanding the dynamics of the Wingfeather Saga characters. First is striving for significance. So Adler believed that all people are always trying to move towards achieving significance, belonging, and purpose. And so a child, and a family especially, is, whether consciously or unconsciously, trying to answer the question of who do I need to be in order to matter. Second is family constellation. So this is the idea of the relational system of the family. So as opposed to the family just being broken up of individuals that are entirely unique from each other, it's more about the living roles and expectations that shape and influence each other. So it is not enough to say that mom, dad, eldest, second, third are all individuals. Yes, of course they are, but they also influence each other. And the way that the firstborn will behave is going to naturally help influence how the second and third and onward behave as well. The third, and what we'll probably talk about the most, is fictional finalism. This is kind of a weird term, but essentially it's the internal belief or story that a person lives by. We all have different worldviews and different truths and lies that we are believing about ourselves and about the world around us, and that shapes our behavior and our actions. So, for example, someone's internal story could look like them saying, if I am responsible, then I am valued. Or if I am different, then I will matter. These beliefs are usually not spoken aloud and are usually entirely subconscious, but they end up driving behavior. Fourth, we have overfunctioning and underfunctioning, and this is another one that we're going to see throughout the Wingfeather Saga. One child becomes overly responsible and compensates for the system, whereas another one avoids responsibility because somebody else is carrying it. The family system will naturally balance itself out when one is over-functioning and one is under-functioning. And of course, this can lead to some issues in the family dynamics. Fifth, we have differentiation, and this is especially important for middle children. So if an older sibling already occupies one lane and has a specific personality and behavior type, then the next child is often going to end up having almost the exact opposite personality. This is 100% true in my family. The second born and I could not be further different. I love her, but she and I have very little in common. And a part of that is the whole process of differentiation, where the next sibling ends up occupying a different role in the family. And lastly, we'll talk about mistaken beliefs. So this is essentially the false conclusions that a child will form about themselves because of how they were raised in the family. This is something like, I have to carry everyone, or it's my responsibility, or I have to do something wild and be different in order to get attention. Okay, now that we got all that psychology out of the way, let's actually talk about the book series. So first, we have Janner. Janner is only 12 years old, although he acts much older. He is the eldest brother. He's thoughtful, responsible, inwardly restless. He loves books and journaling and imagination. He wants peace and honestly just the ability to sit down and enjoy books and reading and be at peace without a lot of chaos. And instead, he gets the burden of responsibility well before he is emotionally ready for it. And of course, in the story, he is also the firstborn of the king of the Shining Isle of Aneria. And in Aneria, the firstborn doesn't become the king. The secondborn does, and the firstborn is the throne warden tasked with protecting the king. So what's interesting about what Peterson does here is that not only is Janner the firstborn, but he also has the actual duty to be the firstborn. The story formalizes his role as the firstborn in the idea of the throne warden, and it becomes his job, his vocation. The duty of the throne warden essentially becomes his identity, and his family, his role, his firstborn status, everything teaches him that it is his job to protect. Adler would absolutely love this, because Adler says that the firstborn often over-identifies with authority. He internalizes expectations and aligns with rules and structure and responsibility, and this kind of leads him to becoming a junior parent of the family, especially if there is a younger sibling who creates chaos. I've got 3 of those. And that is Janner to a painful degree. It's also me to a painful degree. And his whole life is shaped by this fictional finalism of the phrase, I must protect to have value. That is the internal rule that he lives by. And the book essentially makes this explicit. In book 4, right after Cal attacks him and leaves him, and Janner is alone in this dark cave and doesn't know what to do next, we see the quote, protect. This time he imagined Artham's voice, Esbin's voice too. Suddenly he heard Nia, Podo, Oscar, and Lily, all speaking quietly, urging him as he had been urged since he was born. Look out for your brother. You are a throne warden. Kalmar Needs You. This is book 4, page 306. So this is literally him internalizing that family voice and that fictional finalism. Adler talks about how the family system gets inside you and becomes a part of you. It stops just being an external voice and is your internal narrator, your conscience, your reflex, your default mode. And for Janner, this is not only be good, it is your brother's safety is your job. And so this is where things get interesting, because the firstborn often feels responsible, and of course Janner perfectly fits this. He ends up coming across as a rather serious kid, but that is because he is carrying a system that's too heavy for him. Because Tink is not about to stop being in trouble. Over and over again, Tink is going to create chaos, and Janner is going to get dragged into it. Even from the very beginning, Tink finds the map, and Janner gets pulled into that quest at Angle Jelly Manor, chasing after Pete. Again and again, throughout the whole series, Tink runs into chaos, and then Janner has to begrudgingly run after Tink. There's this perfect line in, I think it's the end of book 1, which says, Janner marveled at Tink's ability to coerce him into bad situations. That is funny, but it's also like the entirety of sibling dynamics in one sentence. Janner is the responsible one, but that responsibility requires him to do irresponsible things because Tink has detonated the situation once again. Oh boy, how many times have my sisters gotten to me in trouble? Jeez, too many times to count. And the interesting thing is, because Janner is a throne warden, Podo and Nia end up reinforcing this fictional finalism for him. Book 2, page 2, Podo essentially tells Janner, if Tink is too stubborn to drop what he's doing, Janner, it falls to you to find a way to persuade him. So it's Janner's job to manage Tink. That is classic overfunctioning. One child becomes the structure because the other child is not being required to become it. And so then we get my tally. I kept track of a few things throughout the series, and the amount of times that Tink does something stupid, 21 times. Meanwhile, amount of times that Janner does something stupid, 4. I promise that I do not dislike Tink at all, nor do I dislike any middle child, but geez, Tink, you got into trouble 21 times and did so many stupid things. But here's the thing, amount of times Tink actually gets in trouble or rebuked by the family. 1. He did 21 things, and he only gets in trouble once. But amount of times that Janner gets in trouble or danger because of Tink, 13 times. Oh my goodness, do I feel this myself? The amount of times I got in trouble because my sisters intentionally instigated it and were trying to push all my buttons so that I would blow up and get mad at them, and then I would get in trouble for their actions. Whew, okay. This isn't my own counseling session. We're talking about Janner and Tink. So Janner gets dragged into all of Tink's messes, and yet what Janner actually likes is books and journaling and exploring in his imagination and staying relatively safe. He doesn't actually want to spend his life cleaning up all of Tink's nonsense. He would like some peace, he would like some quiet, and wants to be in spaces where his temperament actually fits. Which brings me to my bookbindery rant. Okay, I have to talk about this because this drove me crazy. Okay, book 3, pages 114 to 117. Oh my gosh, let Janner learn in the bookbindery. Dang it, seriously. Okay, this really bugged me while I was reading it. The fact that Nia forced Janner to be in the Durgan Guild because of Cal, that bugged me so much. Janner wants to be in the bookbindery because after all the chaos that he went through and that Tink put him through, he actually could have a space that is quiet and intellectual and reflective and safe. He could actually make friends that have similar interests as him. He can have order in words and meaning and actually be himself as opposed to just be a part of his family. And so Janner hears that opportunity, and finally he has something that he can do that is his, and he loves it and is so excited. And then what happens? Kalmar's like, oh yeah, sure, I can do the bookbindery too. And that, of course, is because the whole school is wanting to hurt Cal, so understandably he'd want to stay close to Janner. But then his mom is like, oh no, Cal, you shouldn't do the bookbindery, you wouldn't enjoy it. And suddenly the entire situation revolves around Cal. Cal wants to do the Durgan Guild, which is great for him. He can be energetic and wild and get into lots of fights, and it's perfect. But Nia, of course, has to say, you can only do it if your brother goes with you. And so now it is Janner's responsibility to give up what he wants to do and do what is the worst possible for him. Instead of getting to be in peace and learn about books, he gets beat up and pulled into a crazy environment with spies and fighters. He has to adapt so that Cal won't be bored. Oh my, that it bugs me. Why not just let Cal be bored? Okay, sure, later in the book, he says he enjoys it, and Nia makes him his favorite meal that night, which softens things a little bit, and of course, Cal does apologize later, but I'm still miffed. Because, sure, Janner can adapt, we already knew that, but the family system, once again, is privileging Kalmar's desires over Janner's developmental needs. Now, let's pause here. Is some of this anger on Janner's behalf actually just me projecting onto the character? Yeah, 100%, totally. That is going on. I am projecting and releasing my own thoughts about my childhood onto Janner. I am the eldest in an extremely extroverted family that loves adventure. All I want to do is read in peace, and then my family has to drag me into going ziplining and cliff jumping and whitewater rafting and spelunking, which, okay, spelunking is fun, but seriously, I love my family, but I always end up exhausted after hanging out with them as I'm dragged into all of their wild adventures. Why can't we just sit around and have some deep conversations and do some reading? Why do we have to go on an 8-mile hike? Anyways, we were talking about Janner. Yes, let Janner bookbind. The fact that Nia insisted that Cal choose something that he'd enjoy and said it's Janner's responsibility to do that as well, that's just plain wrong. You're allowing Tink to be underfunction, and the system is supposed to bend to Tink's impulses, and Janner is required to overfunction and give up his preferences for the duty of going along with Cal. Oh my, that bugged me. Anyways, back to what we were talking about with Adlarian theory. So what we see happen is that Janner's problem is not just that he protects, because of course that's good, but he starts to believe that protecting is the only thing that makes him who he is. And this is classic Adlarian parentified child. He acts significantly older than he actually is. Tink is literally 1 year younger than him, and yet Janner feels significantly older because of all the emotional weight that he has to carry. But good news for all of us firstborns, Janner and his arc throughout the series actually shows a great way of working through this. So at first, Janner's identity is very role-based. He is the protector, he is the one who keeps things together, he is the one who keeps his siblings safe and alive, he is the one who manages Cal, and that does not work very well at all, and only creates arguments and tension between the two of them. But over time, as the story progresses, Janner eventually has to accept that he can't actually save the person he is built to save. Every single time he tries to control Cal, it just backfires drastically and makes things way worse than it was before. No amount of vigilance or responsibility or inner guilt or grit can stop Cal from choosing, failing, being corrupted, becoming a Fang, attacking him, and running from him. Regardless of what Janner did, that's what Tink would have ended up doing. And so Janner actually can't control his brother. And that is difficult for him to learn, because if your value is entirely built on responsibility, then the moment you can't produce that outcome, it shakes your whole identity. And of course, that's exactly what we see in his uncle, Ertham Wingfeather, who is also the Throne Warden, that firstborn. We see how his mind becomes entirely fractured over entirely placing his identity in something that he can't control. And so Janner cannot control Tink, but that is where Janner has to learn and grow. So the average modern story would show Janner rejecting his role as the protector to embrace his own individualism and selfishness, which maybe, to be fair, I was kind of just advocating for that with the whole bookbindery thing, which, okay, I guess I don't want to retract that, but probably should. Don't want to, though. But whereas most stories would say that Janner needs to reject his family and reject his role and duties and become his own individual person, that is not actually what we see happen here. Instead of Janner becoming selfish and irresponsible, he doesn't stop loving his brother, and he doesn't throw off duty to become selfish. Instead, that burden becomes purified, which I think is really cool how he does this. So he goes from control-based responsibility to chosen sacrificial love. And that distinction is really tricky, but actually really important. So at the beginning of the series, Janner is protecting because he's told that's what he has to do. But then Janner stays, and Janner ends up sacrificing himself because of love. And the final words of the last book on page 49, I think, perfectly sums this up. It says, Janner Wingfeather never left his brother's side. He loved him to the end. That is what the firstborn role can look like and should look like. Not where Janner has to control Kalmar, but Janner can lay down his life for Kalmar. His story shows transformation of responsibility into love, and taking the crushing weight of duty and transforming that into willingly self-giving. Okay, now that we've talked enough about the firstborn and how amazing we are and perfect and have no problems ever, now let's talk about Kalmar / Tink, or Cal, all the names. Also known as Chaos Incarnate in Child Form. Oh boy, he got better, but man was he pushing my buttons and annoying me at the beginning. Tink is 11, which is only 1 year behind Janner. And he is the second-born, who is wild, impulsive, and curious. He loves food, sketching, play, running really quickly. He is constantly getting into trouble without thinking, and by that I mean physical trouble. As I mentioned earlier, he only actually gets rebuked by his family one time in the whole series. And his story revolves around identity. Who he is versus who he's meant to be. And his arc is really interesting throughout the series as he goes from this carefree boy named Tink to this broken identity as a Fang, and then ultimately to the redeemed king as Kalmar Wingfeather, king of the Shining Isle of Anaria. So Adler would say that there are lots of factors that would affect sibling dynamics, and one of those is if the firstborn and secondborn are born very close to each other and are both of the same gender. And that is what we have with the Wingfeather Saga. Kalmar is only a year behind Janner, and they're both male. And so what usually will tend to happen with middle children, according to Adler, is that they will develop in the space between siblings and under a high pressure of comparison. And this case is even more extreme when the two are close in age and the same gender. So Janner is the responsible one who is thoughtful and rule-following and respected and mature. And so for Tink, that means he is comparing himself to Janner. And he obviously cannot out Janner. Therefore, he differentiates, which is he becomes the opposite of Janner in many ways. So instead of competing to be more responsible, he differentiates by doing the opposite. His fictional finalism is something like, I must become different to matter. And all of that fits his traits well. Reckless, impulsive, playful, chaotic, curious. Man, I feel like I'm just describing my own sisters. Fast, troublemaking, hungry all the time. Okay, not sure if Adler had hungry on his list for middle children, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised. The middle child tends to love pushing boundaries and embracing the chaos. And that defines Tink, and boy does that define my sisters. I love them. Wow. So these are not random quirks, they are the process of differentiation, embracing the side of you that is different from the eldest. And the system reinforces this. So the more that Tink creates chaos, the more Janner compensates. And the more Janner compensates, the less Tink has to grow. And so that overfunctioning and underfunctioning essentially creates a unhealthy loop that prevents either of them from growing. And this is the dynamic between the two of them that we see the whole series, basically. Tink gets away with so much, and as I mentioned earlier, he gets rebuked only once by his family. Just once. Meanwhile, he's out here putting the whole plot into motion. One bad decision after another gets him in trouble. Okay, book 3 with all the livestock thing and the Turley thing alone should count as like 20 points against him in the amount of times he gets his family into trouble. Nia literally okay, she should not have had to go through that because of Tink's recklessness and foolishness. But, of course, Tink does not stay as the rebellious younger brother. Yes, he is the middle child, but he has to figure out who he is under that crushing weight of comparison and this impossible calling. Because in the Shining Isle of Veneria, second-born sons become kings instead of the firstborn, which is just amazing idea. Big fan of that one, Andrew Peterson. So everything gets inverted. Janner is usually the one acting like a leader, but Tink is the one who's actually the heir to the throne. And because of that, this creates psychological chaos in both of them. The responsible child doesn't get to be the king, very sad, and the chaotic child is the one that has to step up and become responsible. So in the identity that he has formed for himself out of differentiation, he is the wild one. But his formal destiny is kingship. And so his whole arc is about who is his identity. And this is, of course, embodied in even his name. Is his name Tink or is his name Kalmar? He resists responsibility because of that fear of the burden that's being placed on him. He resists responsibility because that is his natural state. And so his story ends up leading him through corruption and restoration, instead of him just getting a little more mature. He has to find out the hard way. And yeah, middle children, they usually have to find out the hard way. And this tension is best exemplified in the Strander arc that we see in book 2. Tink gets captured by the Stranders, and he ends up being able to use his speed to steal the Strander King's pone, which saves the family and technically makes him the leader of the Strander gang. And meanwhile, when Janner sees Tink running, Janner thinks that he's running away and calls him a coward. Whoopsies. And actually, Tink is stepping up in a very specific way that perfectly fits his character. It's all about attention and freedom and rulelessness and belonging on his own terms. And so he loves it. This is like his favorite thing ever. He gets celebrated for his rule breaking and his lawlessness and his lack of responsibility, and becomes a hero in the Stranders' eyes. And so from an Adlarian perspective, this makes perfect sense. Tink embraces this idea of the Stranders celebrating him for his lack of responsibility. This is something that Tink loves, and he is able to find significance outside of the family system. He's no longer Janner's problem. He is important and wanted and the center of attention. This is like catnip for a child who has spent his whole life differentiating. And yet it's also a distortion because it is being celebrated for something that is wrong. He is belonging in a way with the Stranders, but it is without responsibility. He's recognized, but without maturity, and while it seems to align with his identity, it is not with his true identity, just the one that he has created for himself. And boy, does it backfire. Whew! Because later, when Janner and Tink get separated from the rest of the family, Janner is focused on finding the family. He's scared, he's freaked out, and he is trying to get him and his brother back to his family safely. Meanwhile, Tink is just thinking about the Stranders, how fun it was to have no responsibility and to not have to be the king over an area. And so he runs off from Janner and goes back to the Stranders. Meanwhile, Janner gets lost and enslaved at the Fork Factory, where he stages that rebellion to escape, and that was a great moment for him. Great story, loved it. Meanwhile, Tink gets beaten up by the Strander leader, sold to the Fangs, and then of course, in a very shocking moment, that I could not believe, which, okay, maybe I shouldn't have because he's a wolf on the cover of some of the books. So I guess I should have known that. But it was very surprising, and Ting agrees to sing the song that turns him into a Grey Fang. It's almost like Adler wrote this book, because this, perfectly fits with Adlerian psychology. He goes seeking significance, finds external validation, and boy does it backfire and deform him. Literally deforms him into a wolf. This is middle child danger taken way to the extreme. Differentiation becomes corruption. It is the common middle child impulse to say, I will become my own thing. But often it can create a catastrophic identity collapse, because Cal literally loses himself. Actually. And the tragedy is that Janner, whose whole role is built around protecting him, can't do it. Can't stop it. And because of that over-functioning, under-functioning relationship, once Cal is by himself, he is unable to make the right choices. And then, of course, they reunite, and as a Fang, Ting attacks Janner and nearly kills him, and Janner has to dive into the water to save them both, and his wounds are horribly bad, and it's all Ting's fault. On a slightly less extreme note, this reminds me of the time when my little sisters held me down and tried to braid my hair. Obviously, less extreme, and I did not nearly bleed out from that, but still. So, even here, at this moment, when Tink loses his identity completely and almost kills his brother, his story is not finished. Because, of course, the Maker is still working and redeeming it, and his identity ends up being restored. And this is perfectly captured in Book 4, when Cal has to go into the Fane of Fire, which is the specific area that only the king of an area can go down into to walk with and meet with the Maker. And so only Cal's allowed to go in. Janner has to wait outside, and understandably, Janner's a little jealous. I would be. He's spent his whole life acting like someone who carries the weight, and now he has to be the one who just sits on the sidelines as his brother steps up. And this is super crucial for Cal, because he is now having to accept the identity as king. This is not something he invented out of differentiation. This is no longer his identity being entirely reactionary, where he is just trying to be different and not be Janner. Instead, he is receiving his true identity as the king, and he is accepting who he was meant to be and who the Maker created him to be, as opposed to his identity solely being about differentiation. So at the beginning, his fictional finalism is that he has to be different to matter. And then his mature calling ends up being that he receives who he is, which is king over the shining isle of an area. As a side note, I also want to mention the whole thing about him being afraid of heights, because that's weird, right? So in Book 1, he is terrified of heights. It is a notable trait that comes up several times and gets him special treatment, but is also kind of inconsistent in the book. Okay, he's climbing around on treetops, totally fine. Gets a little nervous, but he's fine. He's on the edge of cliffs. He could clearly function, even if he's afraid. And then it disappears after Book 1. It was already inconsistent in Book 1, and then suddenly it disappears, and it's never mentioned again in Book 2, 3, or 4. Even though there are examples where you'd think it would be mentioned, like when he rides around on a dragon. I feel like that would make me a little nervous if I was terrified of heights. So, okay, in the real world, it's probably just a writing issue. The trait got added to the character to create some unique character traits, but then it ended up getting dropped because it really didn't fit the character at all and was just weird. And of course, we see that with the show, where it's not at all mentioned. And so, more than likely, that's the reason why. But if we wanted an in-universe psychological explanation for why Tink is afraid of heights in the first book, inconsistently, and then never again, there's actually a decent argument that Adler's theories could explain that. So Adler argued that symptoms can be goal-directed. So this essentially means that a symptom or a presenting problem could be over exaggerated to an effect in order to get something. So the fear actually has a purpose. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that all fear is fake, obviously, but it does sometimes mean that a behavior or weakness gets something for the character. As an example, when my sister broke her arm, oh boy, did she milk that. She loved not having to do any chores and getting waited on and having everything revolve around her. It was great for her. If it weren't for constantly needing to itch under her cast, she would have probably just been fine with a cast on. And so for Tink, let's say that, sure, he might have been a little afraid, but what if he was exaggerating it a little bit, or just partly using it for attention? It would certainly fit that middle child framework pretty well. So by acting afraid of heights, he gets significance, he gets protection, he gets special treatment. It shifts the conversation to being about him and focus on him. And so through weakness, he actually gets control. And then, of course, as Tink gets a stronger identity, and as the story progresses, he no longer needs to use that exaggerated fear. In books 2 through 4, he has much bigger and more dramatic ways of getting significance. The whole thing with the Stranders and being a Fang, and then of course being king, the fear-based vulnerability is no longer really needed. And so, while more than likely it is just Peterson dropped the plot point because it didn't really fit the character well, here is a way that you can make everything be synthesized well with Adlerian psychology. So let me know in the comments what you think of my argument there and if that makes sense, because I think that's actually a pretty good explanation for why Cal is afraid of heights. Oh boy, this is going to be a long video because we still have to talk about Lily. Okay, so Lily is 9. She is the youngest sibling, and is gentle and joyful and resilient and compassionate and basically never complains. And okay, if anyone was going to complain, she has a pretty good excuse. Throughout the whole series, she has to go through a lot and has pretty good excuses to complain, with her broken leg and her dog dying and all of these things that happen. Meanwhile, okay, I love my youngest sister so much. She's so sweet. But boy, does she know how to complain. Oh my, oh, sweet girl. She is very good at complaining. So anyways, Lily plays the whistle harp and has this great way with animals, especially dogs. And while she starts out very much in the background, over the course of the series, she ends up becoming, in a way, the spiritual center of the family. So Janner is burdened with the firstborn role, and Tink is the identity-struggling middle child. Meanwhile, Lily is the youngest child who grows in quiet power. So Adler often saw that the youngest children were very much protected and babied, but also highly adaptive. So because they come into an already existing family structure, they're not usually the one that takes over. Instead, they are very much moving with the emotional currents that are already there. And that pretty much perfectly describes Lily. She's not focused on authority like Janner or disruption like Tink. She is more about relational balance. Instead of controlling the family system, she's almost as the regulator, being a source of peace, especially to Podo, mentioned several times, especially in the first book, but throughout the whole series, where she emotionally regulates Podo, where she calms him down and is that source of peace for the family. Not just for Podo, but also for Nia, for Ertham, for the boys. That fits her and really fits the youngest child role. Because the youngest children don't have necessarily the authority or the disruptive power of the older two, the youngest often develops significant social awareness and emotional intelligence, and usually creativity as well. And yes, that is basically Lily. She pretty much is in the background for almost the entire series. She's not at all driving the events, but she's always providing a source of gentleness and strength and emotional steadiness that all of the family relies on, even if they don't realize it. And so while Janner and the parents, of course, would be seeing Lily as the one they need to protect and baby, in reality, she is providing emotional strength and peace that the family desperately needs. According to my count, She gets babied 5 times, but that is almost entirely in book 1, which makes sense. As the youngest, as being physically disabled, she's understandably protected. And Adler would say that this kind of position can take 2 paths. One is dependence, where others are going to care for me, and the other is compensation, where I will prove that I'm more than what people assume. And often these can both be taken to the extreme, where the youngest becomes way too dependent on the family or significantly overcompensates by trying to be entirely different. And what is interesting about Lily is that we kind of see traits for both of those paths in her, but when the opportunity comes, she really does step up. For a long time, Lily is sidelined, and obviously, in terms of overt plot centrality, she is almost a background character. She's pretty much just there, and then we'll throw in a few lines about her comforting Poto or Eritham, or hanging out with her dogs, or playing her whistle harp, and that's about it. Meanwhile, the guys are doing all the loud, destructive, dramatic, crazy stuff as they move the plot forward. And psychologically, this fits really well, where the youngest is very much influencing indirectly that seems less dominant, but becoming indispensable. Then, of course, in book 4, things change. Her brothers are off doing their own thing, making some reckless choices. Well, at least Tink is. Janner's following along because he has to. And while they're off doing their own thing, Lily steps into visible significance and uses her music and dog speak and her way with animals to basically win the war for the Hollows folk. She is able to use her creativity and talents to fight back against the Fangs and keep the village from losing. This fits well with that idea of redeeming the youngest child arc. So she moves from being entirely cared for to becoming life-giving, and from being protected to becoming powerful, but in a very gentle and entirely Lily way. So she doesn't become a different character. She steps up to her duty. Instead of mattering by becoming a copy of her brothers, she becomes herself. Peterson could have given her an epic sword-wielding moment where she fights off the Fangs single-handedly, but that wouldn't have really made sense for the character. Instead, she is able to use the gift she actually has to make a huge difference. And so, while at first she's sidelined, she ends up being really central to the whole story, and of course steps up in a big way in book 4. So now that we have way over dissected Janner, Kalmar, and Lily, we can look at the whole family dynamics, because I have not seen very many books that do a very good job of showing family relationships and dynamics in a realistic and engaging way, but the Wingfeather Saga actually did a really good job about this. So they all have their functions and roles in the family, and these have good things and bad things about this. Janner overfunctions, Tink underfunctions, Lily regulates emotionally, and so Janner essentially represents structure, whereas Tink is disruption and Lily is stabilization. Janner takes responsibility, so Tink gets to avoid it. Tink avoids responsibility, and Janner takes it on. Meanwhile, Lily is essentially the one that helps the family survive the emotional fallout of all of the chaos. And that is where we start with the characters, but by the end, we see that Janner has to accept that he can't protect Cal by forcing Cal to make the right choices, and instead he steps up in sacrificial love. Meanwhile, Cal loses his identity entirely and has to learn responsibility and duty. And Lily has to come to a place where she is using the gifts and talents and creativity no longer on the margins to step up in a big way. And so the system breaks, but all of that is necessary because none of the dynamics were healthy, and if the dynamics didn't change, then the characters themselves wouldn't change. That is why there is a whole field of counseling called family therapy, where instead of it being an individual counselor sitting down with a client, it is the whole family sitting with a counselor, and they're discussing family dynamics and how all of that functions and how the family system can grow and be more healthy. Because if the family system can, then then the individuals can as well. And so all the characters end up growing in a way that is powerful and meaningful and true to each character. What I love is that there are plenty of stories about an individual that shows the wounds of a family and how unhealthy family dynamics can destroy a person. But few stories actually show a whole family and show how unhealthy patterns can be transfigured and transformed into something that is healthy and true for all of these characters. The Wingfeather Saga perfectly understands that people become themselves not in isolation, but in relation to others, especially family. Roles in a family can help or distort a person's identity. Redeeming that looks like not just becoming a different person entirely and completely rejecting one's family. Instead, it means allowing God to redeem that role and what was a survival strategy becoming God's calling over your life. That is why Janner still feels like Janner throughout the series, just purified by the end. Cal still feels like Cal, just ultimately restored. And Lily still feels like Lily, just unveiled. So, to sum everything up, after this very long video, geez, my voice is a little tired. I think the Wingfeather Saga siblings perfectly embody Adler's birth order patterns in a way that not only gives rich meaning to Adler's birth order psychology, but also how that can be redeemed and used by God to glorify him. So Janner is that firstborn who is responsible, over-functioning, and has internalized duty. Kalmar is the middle child who is differentiating, has identity instability, creates chaos and collapse, but ultimately is restored. And Lily is the youngest child, the baby of the family, who has a lot of relational influence and hidden strength and quiet centrality. And the beauty is that the series takes those patterns and turns them into something redeemed. So Janner stops being the brother who has to protect and becomes the brother who chooses to lay down his life. And very touching scene. Cal stops being the boy who has to be different and becomes the king who receives who he is. And Lily stops being the one who is just cared for and becomes the one who gives life to others. And that is not only something that a character can do, but it is also something that we can see in our own lives. Regardless of which character you identify more with, God can redeem your past, your history, your family, your fictional finalism, and restore how he created you and give you his identity over your life. That doesn't look like rejecting everything you've ever experienced. It looks like seeing what God wants to do in your life and how he wants to redeem your story. That is something that is incredibly powerful and meaningful, not just for a character in a book, but for us as well. And that is something that God specializes in. And so I wasn't necessarily planning on ending this video with a biblical call to action, but I feel like it needs it. So if you're in that place of feeling stuck, of feeling burdened, of feeling like you are differentiating, of feeling like you are lost and forgotten, wherever you are, God can redeem and restore. He is the one who is not only the author of our stories, but he is also the one who is redeeming our stories, if we choose to let him. If we choose to step up and say yes, and let God transform the lies we were believing about ourselves into genuine truths that can give life and make a powerful impact around us. And so what that looks like is allowing yourself to go through the process of transformation. It looks like seeking God, prayer, reading your Bible, going to church, spending time in worship and journaling. Maybe it looks like going to counseling, because ultimately this isn't about us. It is about understanding our identity so that God can use us. It's almost bizarre thinking that our identity is not about us, but it isn't. It is about God. It is about who God created us and how God can use us to make an impact. So my prayer is that all of us will not only see that in the Wingfeather Saga, but can ultimately live that out in our own lives. And I feel like I should end out on a prayer. So, Lord, I pray that you will teach us how to restore our identities in you. I pray that you will show us what it looks like to seek after you and to have you redeem who we are and carry out your purpose for our lives, regardless of what birth order we are, regardless of what we believe about ourselves or who we've made ourselves into. Show us what your identity is for our lives. Show us who you've created us to be and how you can redeem and transform the lies we're believing into your truth. Thank you, Lord, for what you're doing in each and every one of us. And I pray that we will see it to completion. Amen. All right, well, this was quite a long video. Hopefully you found it interesting. A little more of a deep dive than I was planning into, well, the series and Adlerian psychology and theology, apparently. But hopefully it was interesting. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you are for birth order-wise. Are you like me and the amazing firstborn that can do no wrong? No. God is actively working on me and redeeming my identity as well as the rest of my family's, just as he wants to do for you. Let me know where you are on that journey and what you thought of the Wingfeather Saga and the character's journey in that. And of course, let me know if this kind of thing is interesting. Would you like more long-form videos where I dissect things like this? I'm more than happy to do it, but this certainly was a bit more than I was planning on. So hopefully it's enjoyable. Let me know in the comments if this is something you want more of.